you're here to join in this conversation that is going to be led by our visiting scholar, Dr. Angela Flynn. She's visiting us from the University of Cork, which is a university in the southern part of Ireland. Yeah. And Angela brings, she's a guest really of ours in the Cry-High unit because she's looking to tap our expertise and build some collaborations with us. Angela is one of those nurse scholars who stepped outside into the social science theoretical pond and then now is trying to bring that, marry that those theoretical traditions with the ways in which we develop nursing knowledge. So she's going to talk to us about her work, and she's also available to talk with you. She's here for another week, and so we're very fortunate to have her here. And look forward to her presentation.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Judy, and I'm delighted to be here. And thank you so much for everybody in Cry-High and the School of Nursing for being so facilitative and helpful and just generally nice. And I'm delighted to be here, and I suppose the title I've given, I was on retrospect, I'm thinking maybe the impact on health was possibly a little ambitious, maybe so much as the use of this particular theoretical perspective. So I'm a lecturer in nursing in Cork, and my background is in cardiothoracics and intensive care nursing, and as Judy said, I did my PhD outside of nursing but in the social sciences. So a little bit of an unusual strategy. But in my research, where I was looking at Ireland's healthcare system, which is a deeply inequitable two-tiered health system, I used a number of theoretical perspectives, and one of them is what I'm going to be talking about today, which is the political theory of possessive individualism, which is a bit heavy for a Friday afternoon, but it's incredible. I mean, who doesn't want political theory on a Friday afternoon? So I'm going to look at this theory of possessive individualism today and its origins, and maybe try to look at how it might be useful for us to look at healthcare and health provisions. And it sort of speaks very closely with issues of rights and a rights-based discourse. So who was this guy, C.B. Macpherson? He was a political theorist who identified the notion of possessive individualism as something that was the underlying assumption of all English political thought from the 17th to the 19th century, and he sort of called it possessive individualism and said that there was a real difficulty with the fact that most political theory had been based upon this assumption that, and he said that this was a difficulty within modern liberal democratic theory. He said possessive individualism was the predominant assumption of English political thinking from Locke to Mill, and that this was a period where the solid establishment of capitalism, when the whole of society became recast within market relations. So he sort of identified this as sort of underlying most political thought and economic thought as well. So I felt this might be a very useful perspective to take. So this is his book, The Political Theory of Possessive Individualism, from Hobbes to Locke. And he said the problem with possessive individualism is its possessive quality, and was found in its conception of the individual, so the individual person, as essentially the proprietor of his own person or capacities, owing nothing to society for them. So this was a pretty seminal text. It was published in the 60s, and he identified this conception of man as the owner of his own person and his labours. And that this was the only thing that made man free, was freedom from dependence on the will of others, was the fact that we had this possession of ourselves and our labour. So he went on to say that theories that came subsequent to this time were born in this capitalist society and therefore came from this negative ontology. He argued that these assumptions do correspond substantially to the actual relations of a market society, and that these were what gave liberal theory its strength. And he felt, so these theories were were so predominant that it was difficult to critique these assumptions or to even see that they were underlying. A couple of people have commented and used C.B. Macpherson's work, not that many, mostly within the political theoretical field. So he said that although these philosophical theories were built on these bourgeois assumptions, by virtue of their immersion in the context of capitalist market society, that's why that they were ill-suited. And he draws on Hobbes's models of society, identifying the possessive market society, which when we talk about health and health provisions, it's very easy to see a very strong market has emerged there. So most major political thought of the 17th century onwards was based on this sort of bourgeois ontology, as he said. I'm going to go forward a little bit more because I'm kind of repeating myself a little bit here. So Macpherson said that Hobbes saw all human attributes as commodities to be contracted for and exchanged at values set by the impersonal operation of the market, whatever the market is in a place of power, and who reduced justice to the performance of a contract. And so he argued that possessive individualism is flawed as it generates this impoverished view of life, obscuring deeper human purposes and capacities. So it certainly is a very sort of harsh conception of the individual as merely a market participant. So I suppose what he was saying was that all people writing in this phase and theorizing would be subject to and impinged by the nature of this society in which they're writing. And when we're writing, sometimes perhaps we're not conscious of the extent to which we are being influenced by the era that we're in, the political thought that we're subject to, the economics of the world and the place we're in. So he said it was impossible for a writer to write unimpinged by this approach. Okay, so some people who have looked at how Macpherson's work include Bowers, who said in the concept of possessive individualism, the identity is based on ownership and the individual is defined as essentially the proprietor of his own person or capacities. So this possessive individual, and I've put this beside a picture of a waiting room in a hospital, the possessive individual is thus an autonomous independent person, free from others and free to enter into relations of his or her own choosing. So when we try and consider the participant in healthcare, the patient, the recipient of care, as a possessive individual, there's a problem here. In contrast to traditional conceptions of society, a society made up of such individuals in a possessive society is based not on ascribed statuses and pre-assigned roles, but on market relations, so capacity to engage in a market. So possessive individualism as a political philosophy of capitalist societies is what we're getting at here. And in this state, it promotes individual ownership. There is a dominance and power for those who are in possession. There's enforced selling of labour, hierarchy of ownership, a devaluation of communal or societal domains. It's socially divisible, so we become more and more atomized as individuals. And it's people who are vulnerable are left more vulnerable in times of crisis. And it results in an individualization and victim blaming. And we'd be very familiar with that, certainly that last point in relation to many approaches to health and health promotion. So the divisive and unequal bit is particularly been taken up. The possessive individualist version of democracy denies and conceals the oppression and class domination inherent in a society based upon private and unequal property. So when we think of property, we often think of buildings and land and things like that, but we can also think of things like health insurance policies. We can think of capacity to go privately for services. So the socially divisive nature was inherent, Macpherson said, within capitalist market economies. And it created a dominant and a subservient class. And freedom for the former was only created through dominance over the latter, so the freedom of the more dominant classes. So this concealed class domination was a particular theme that Macpherson identified. And it had the effect of reducing human relations to market relations, market exchanges. So this is what was called concealed class domination. So Macpherson's work has a distinctly Marxian take, and he said that at the heart of possessive individualism is a society of atomized, free and equal individuals, self-proprietors whose obligations are based upon rational self-interest. So perhaps you could refer to commodity fetishism. So Macpherson says that possessive individualism, I like this description, that it's a treadmill that gives us continuous and agreeable employment, but will not add much to our knowledge of the wheel. So we spend time looking at the wheel that we are in, and not actually, spending our time looking at the scrutiny of the threads of this wheel in which we are in, rather than getting outside of it. Again, Townsend, who's taken up possessive individualism, says if we continue to see ourselves as infinite consumers and appropriators, in short, as possessive individualists, we continue to embrace an ideology functional to the capitalist market, then all of these problems, and Townsend listed off everything from, global warming to, mass problems with unemployment and poverty, and he sort of one of those really long, depressing lists. And he basically said, if we continue along this road, this is where we're going. Disparities of wealth, and we know the gap in inequalities is growing. So he referred to this as liberal democracy's darker side. Now we could identify as well neoliberalism, which David Harvey's seminal book explains very well. That basically we have three features that define neoliberalism: that there is market fundamentalism and competition, minimal state involvement or obligation, and privatization, individualization, and personal responsibility. So those are the sort of the three hallmarks of neoliberalism, which you can see have come very neatly from the capitalist ontology that Macpherson was talking about. So these are your three principles: that competition is the major market vehicle, that societies are composed of autonomous individuals, and that the markets are the best way, most efficient allocators of resources. And when we look at how health providers are starting to look at alternative methods, increasingly we're being given the message that we should allow free market activity to engage, and that will provide the most efficient delivery of resources. So that's for many, that's very problematic. So Coburn looked at particularly the most neoliberal countries to see, what happens in those countries, and surprise, surprise, the more neoliberal government policies are, the greater the inequalities, greater social inequalities, more people in absolute and relative poverty, and these inequalities have implications both within and between nation inequalities. And Wilkinson and Pickett's work, of course, has shown that the more unequal society aren't just bad for the people in the lower socioeconomic groups, but the more unequal a country is, the worse it is for everybody within that country. So I'm going to go forward a little bit into. It's frozen. Let's see if I can do it this way. No. Something's happened. Oh, there we go. Maybe we're meant to stop there and talk, yeah. So I suppose the individualization is a particular feature of a neoliberal approach. And when we look at this in relation to healthcare, this creeping culture of privatization is very strong, and it pushes responsibility to the individual. There have been a changed sense of social expectations. If you are concerned about your healthcare to the point where you engage in a private market, you are not just participating in the market, but you're actually demonstrating yourself to be a good citizen, a good, responsible citizen who's looking after the individual and their family. So, but this feeds into the notion of the individual as being particularly you're worth it. You're the individual, you're worth it. Healthcare is no different. In Ireland in particular, the citizen is consistently subjected to a barrage of messages that inform them of a sense of deservedness to a better, swifter and more effective form of healthcare. There's very subtle advertising on the radio and on the television. There's one that begins with the voice of an elderly lady talking about when you're unwell, it's very good to know that someone is there to look after you. And as the ad progresses towards the end, she takes on the voice of this private hospital that is encouraging you to purchase private policy so that you can use this hospital. But she emerges from being a service user into being the hospital by the end of the advert. Which is very, very particular approach. But so in order to achieve this sense of deservedness, you have to engage in this market to elevate your status to that of a private patient. And in so doing, you remove yourself from the communal world of the public patient, the world of waiting lists, public wards, delayed treatments, and as the evidence shows, poorer health outcomes. So how can we use possessive individualism or apply this theory in the context of healthcare? We know there is a powerful and growing private health market as modelled in the US and increasingly in Ireland. We know we've moved away from decommodified welfare systems, increasing class domination and greater inequalities, spelling mistake, that should be health, not heath, as a right. So this class domination that Macpherson referred to can be seen in public hospital waiting rooms up and down Ireland and I'm sure other countries. And in these places, the subordinate, poorer, sicker and more vulnerable members of society are corralled into inadequate spaces with little choice but to resume their wait for untimely and undignified treatment often. Meanwhile, the dominant class members who have undergone no such humiliation and are fast-tracked into plush facilities, access to which they have purchased by virtue of their status as consumers and their subsequent engagement with the market. Their relationship with their healthcare provider is one that is mediated by their health insurance company, a company that is involved in this exchange by virtue of its competitiveness in the market and its success in selling to the dominant citizen the commodity of a health insurance policy. These are true market relations. So health, where labour has become a market commodity, market relations so shape and permeate all social relations that it may properly be called a market society, not merely a market economy. And this picture is from Greece, where during their economic crisis, healthcare needs became a crisis, a real crisis for people. And this is a clinic offering free healthcare with, as you can see, queues outside the door. So the impact of economic problems spilling over into healthcare. How am I doing with time? Good. Okay. I think I might skip over Thomas Paine. He's a bit too much of a pain, but he was a political activist and political theorist who actually was ahead of his time. When he finally died, only 6 people attended his funeral because he had isolated himself so much from popular thought. I thought it was very...
We should all be careful about that.
He became deeply involved in the French Revolution, you know, and he ended up being elected into Parliament even though he couldn't speak French. So I thought that was very interesting. But he argued basically that he talked about social rights, and he was one of the first sort of people to talk about social rights as a compensation for the violation of natural individual property rights. And if you think about the welfare state, that really was what the welfare state was meant to be. It was meant to be the safety net to catch people who fell victim to the markets, where, you know, where capitalist relations were the assumption. So this guy was kind of ahead of his time in 1790s, but he did conceptualize this idea of healthcare as he wasn't talking about healthcare, he was talking about social rights. And it's been taken up by people like your fellow Canadian Johnson Redden, who talked about healthcare as a social right. The right to healthcare seems to have an inalienable collective dimension that is being challenged by possessive individualistic rights claims. So she examined the right to healthcare, and she also, I suggested, it has its roots in non-possessive, non-property-based rights, and that this conception is in tension and conflict with, you know, current individualistic rights claims. And I promised that I came to the idea of possessive individualism before I found that Candace Johnson Redden had as well. So we're just, you know, mutually thinking around. She was a little bit ahead of me in the early 2000s. I hadn't come across her. And it was one of those papers that you're reading thinking, I thought this, yeah. So she said that there was this difficulty with reconciling healthcare entitlement with differentiated conceptions of citizenship and away from litigious asservations and actions. So in other words, rather than saying I have a right to healthcare, that because that is a sort of litigation type road to be travelling, but that healthcare was a different type of right. So in plain language, even though some citizens will be rich and others poor, that there should be certain public goods to which all are entitled on equal terms and conditions without having to claim, you know, I have this right. There's her text, Healthcare, Entitlement and Citizenship, which I thought was an interesting read. But she says that social rights are diminished in the context of retrenchments, in other words, a withdrawal of sort of welfare and universality. Citizens are making legalistic and possessive individualistic rights claims. So we're actually playing into the possessive individualist conceptions in the hope of preserving the social rights regime. And this is, she said, a paradox, because social rights are actually rooted in a normative, objective conception of right, and modern possessive conceptions are a major departure from this. So the right to healthcare should be non-possessive, in other words, is what she's saying. Non-possessive, normative nature of the right to healthcare. I think I've just repeated the text from the previous slide there. So our patient, our client, our service users has been recast as a consumer. And I was at a panel approval meeting for a new program that the economics department in my university wanted to establish in healthcare business management or something snazzy. And the young lad in front of me, who I was shocked to discover was a professor, even though he looked like he should have been, you know, just starting shaving, very snazzy in his suit, started referring to patients as customers. And I just, after a while, I just couldn't take it anymore, and I just said, please, can you stop? And never again refer to a patient as a customer, because they're not customers. You know, he was just in his business mode. But patients are being cast as consumers, and therefore as, I mean, I know in mental health we refer to clients as opposed to patients, but that's sort of a different background. But the citizen with rights and entitlements has been recast as a consumer of public services, a public service that has been opened up to the vagaries of the market. This is a changed nature of a citizen-state exchange from a traditional model of exchange based on needs and obligations and entitlements to a market-like exchange. So like Macpherson was talking about a market society. Even more so, a possessive market society. And in this model, there is equal subordination of every individual to the laws of the market. Macpherson said, every man's entitlements are determined by the actual competitive relationship between the powers of the individuals. What that's going to come down to is capacity to engage in the market and capacity to lay the money down. But of course, there is a perspective that says that this possessive market society that allows you pay your way, that this constitutes freedom. Yeah? But there's nothing as free as the market. Everyone is free to engage in an equal way. It's a very limited perspective. The problem with markets is that sometimes things run short and things run scarce. So we have the issue of scarcity. The vision of scarcity in relation to unlimited desires was a creation of the capitalist market society, this insatiable desire of every man for power to render the person and the properties of others subservient to his pleasures. And I think this image is of a free dental clinic being offered in the US by dental students and dental volunteers in a gym hall. So it's just full of people who can't afford dental treatment. And so there's a scarcity there. They're not engaging in the market. They're failing to play the game. So in Ireland, so in my PhD research, I used 4 particular genealogies to look at Ireland's healthcare, and one of them was a moment when, as a consequence of European law, Ireland was forced to open up the health insurance market to more than just the one semi-state body which had the monopoly up until then. It was an entity called the VHI, Voluntary Health Insurance. So this European Council directive said, look, Ireland, you got to let other guys in here to compete in the market, to allow other providers within the EU to compete. So from this moment on, the moment of this legislation, we could no longer pretend that Ireland had anything other than a market going on within our healthcare. We used to kid ourselves up until then that the VHI, because it was a semi-state sort of body, that we were, it was some kind of universal thing, and they used phraseology, particular discourse around things like community rating and intergenerational solidarity. These were language that was tied into it to make us feel like we were doing something that was contributing to other people's health. So no longer could health cover be seen as anything else other than a marketable commodity to which to be traded on the market and subject to the attendant vagaries of stiff competition. Oops, this keeps going too far. This is an example of a piece that was in the Irish Times in 1996 when Bupa was another private health insurance company in the UK, and they moved into the Irish market. And this particular writer, she wrote about how you could now get policies from Bupa to cover cardiac surgery. She said, this is particularly significant for people on lower incomes who will now be able to jump the lengthy public health service queues for such operations. So it was like, yay, it was a very influential discourse. The Irish Times is the newspaper of record. And it reinforced to the reader that to be enabled to jump a queue is desirable without any requirement to consider that those waiting in the queue over whom one is advised to leap. So from this point onwards, 2 very significant shifts were seen to have occurred. Firstly, healthcare provision was now a legitimately marketable entity open to the vagaries of competition. And secondly, the role of the state in providing a universal welfarist model of healthcare was entirely undermined and successfully eroded so as to be disregarded as archaic and almost a backward concept. One other piece in the Irish Times about Bupa coming into the market says, it is not a matter anymore of wondering whether you need private health insurance, but whether you need VHI or Bupa. So let's just narrow that right down to a choice between these 2 providers. No, let's not even think about any other alternative. So before this point, a myth had perpetuated that what had become known as the VHI could be considered a form of solidaristic provision. So it was a myth, and it was constructed and sustained by particular rhetorical strategies deployed around the meaning of community. So there is a certain irony in this misconception that by establishing their status as private patients, they were in fact establishing a firm individuated status that ensured preferential and swifter healthcare, a very far cry from the notion of community solidarity. So the challenge for us, looking at healthcare through this particular lens, is to avoid what I suppose Macpherson was saying that all other political theorists since that time had fallen into, and that was to write and to theorize with the influences of that particular ontological background. So we should be encouraged. I don't know how these guys are doing this on their heads, but they are looking at things differently. They're looking at things with a different perspective, to see things differently and to write unobscured and unhindered by the capitalist society in which we exist, to see patients and clients as citizens and not consumers in a vast market society, to identify and highlight the inadequacies of market forces in healthcare. And I think that's something that we're almost a little afraid to do too loudly. We will be tarred with a particular brush once you critique the market and critique capitalism. To recognize the failure of possessive individualism as a key failure of capitalism was, I think, another challenge, possibly easier one. And then to advocate so as to establish health as a human right and not as a market commodity. And this is an area in which nursing has a particular voice to add. So I suppose to conclude, what I'm hoping I've shown is a contemporary tension between the conceptions of health as a human right versus health as a commodity, because it relies so heavily on this field of political theory of possessive individualism. But I think political theory does provide a useful backdrop for that. And Macpherson does succeed in exposing the 17th century roots, which provide a problem of legitimacy in the 20th century liberal democracy, and with possessive individualism at its core. And finally, a framing of healthcare with an understanding of possessive individualism, I think, helps us to reveal health inequities and the need for social justice advocacy in order to address these. I think I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much. Happy to take any questions.
Wow, I think this is so interesting. In such an interesting way to sort of start rethinking the assumptions that we see operating. The question, one of the things that I maybe can help you sort of work through, in our context, I see the current sort of challenge we're facing is that we have an explicit commitment to universality. We have a legislative commitment to universality. But where I see these market tensions coming in is the rights of healthcare professionals to engage in a market, to have the right to open up the market and therefore practice unhindered by the commitment to universality. So for us, the pushback, and it's not so much by nurses, I would say, it's principally by physicians who are saying because right now a physician can practice independent of the universal system, but then they can't engage with the universal system. So they can't have it both ways. Mm-hmm. They can only practice outside of the universal system equally, but it's being challenged as a way to shorten the queue, to give people access to a broader array of services. So it's about the problems we have containing the publicly funded system. But it makes me wonder, like, what are the ways we can disrupt that conversation? You know, like what are the ways we can show the consequences of going down that path? Because people, as you've described, really see there's an opportunity for them to pursue their personal interests if that option were available to them. You know, so for me, it's really interesting. Like, could we be in this position, like within our current legislative framework? And I don't know what's in our constitution, not our constitution, well, there's the Health Act, but there's also I want to call it our constitution. our charter. Within our charter, how is health talked about, or the access to health care? I don't know if it's framed as a right in our charter, or if we, sign off on all these free trade agreements. Will we be opening the door to that problem you experience?
No, that's really interesting. That's good. In a way, a lot of the research you guys are doing in relation to health inequity speaks to a demonstration of the failure of sort of capitalist influences in healthcare. But I suppose your example is really good because you're in Canada, from what I understand, your conditions are so much superior to, say, the US, certainly. But when you look at rights that are sort of written into charters and things like that, like the Irish legislation says that everyone's entitled to healthcare. There it is. Absolutely, no problem. So just because, but it doesn't actually manifest itself into, a system that affords any sort of equality of access. So the right is there, but the right to healthcare is there underneath this predominantly hegemonic market force. And I think rights become crushed under that, written as they are.
But I think it's different conceptions of rights, and I thought I really appreciate that we rely a lot on the theory of liberal individualism, and we recently ran into came across 1700s French aristocrat, what was his name, that he toured the U.S. and really does a scathing review of individualism in the U.S. And of course, we're influenced by that U.S. thinking around individualism as well as the kind of the European. But I think that what you nicely pointed out is first of all the importance of possessive individualism, but also secondly the different construction of rights and as a social right, even in the latter you'd say human right, and I think human right glosses over sometimes the theoretical underpinnings of the understanding of rights. And so a student that I work with, a doctoral student that I work with, has sort of taken this idea of the relationship to the oneself, to the body, as ownership, which stems from this whole political way or theoretical approach, and has shown how we construct children and treat children as either potential, based on their market potential, or waste, and then wonder why a rights-based discourse doesn't get us where we need to go. And I think it's because the form of rights analysis that we're offering is actually rooted in the same problem.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that is right.
So I think that if we actually looked at what we mean by rights as social rights as opposed to human rights, which are exactly rooted in the same philosophical perspective, which is a relationship to the body as one's possession. And there's echoes of this too in Vicky Bunge's work with people who do sex work, is that the understanding of sex work is based on the ownership of one's own body, but it obscures, you had a thing up there about obscuring the actual good that a person does and the underlying social relations. And that happens in sex work. The conversation only gets talked about at this level of ownership over the body and rights, not the relationship and what people actually do under the umbrella of sex work. I know that's a bit of a tangent, but I see there's parallels between these and the underlying problem being an actual analysis of the roots of what we understand to be rights.
Thank you. I had a query, if I may, and as somebody who worked in the system in BHI and public healthcare system was, as you say, really founded in very, very strong values, but also had very religious over and undertone. So, and you can go there, we can go there, we've come from the same background, but my experience as a student nurse, because I mostly worked in Ireland as a student nurse quite a long time ago, and my experience was always a tug between BHI, private, and the public system. That was always there. But the way you framed it in terms of how it got represented is really interesting. And then the idea of there are various other ones that are come to play, such that the Irish people that I know are scaling the healthcare system right now. So I think my question was a long-winded way of getting to it. The Celtic Tiger, and for those who aren't so familiar with the Celtic Tiger, it was this surgence of wealth in Ireland 10 years ago or so, where like literally big wealth reshaped the values a lot of people of the Irish nation in terms of what's important in life. Has that had a big impact, do you think, on this whole notion of rights and healthcare and so on and so forth?
I think what that, no, it's a really good point actually, Harvey, but what happened, because following the Celtic Tiger boom years was, of course, an economic crisis and massive levels of unemployment, a lot of house repossessions, a lot of poverty, and we still, to this day, have a housing crisis as a result of our whole family living in hotel rooms, so I think what happened as a result of the crisis was a revelation of the failure of the state to make provisions for its citizens, because the notion of the state provision had become dismissed, and because we had been instructed to look after ourselves, to turn to the market, to purchase our properties, to purchase our policies, there were huge numbers of people who had felt neglected by the state. So whether that equates into an understanding of rights, well, one of the things that was attempted during the crisis, the economic crisis, was to pull back on the provision of free healthcare for over 65. So everyone in Ireland got free healthcare for over 65, which meant you could go to your GP, everything was covered, medicine, the whole lot. Now this was introduced by a particular politician way back in the 80s as an election promise, and he got in, so he did it. So there was an attempt during the economic crisis to withdraw that, and the older adults throughout Ireland mobilised like you've never seen before. And they came from all over Ireland, and they bussed themselves from every corner of the country and formed this massive protest in Dublin one day. And thousands upon thousands. My father was there with an oxygen cylinder. They mobilised very well, they protested, and what do you know, the government recalled that decision and decided it was probably not the best. The cynical people in the country said that the only reason the elderly were able to mobilise was because another thing that they were entitled to for free was public transport. But in actual fact, that point is absolutely true. Look how important free transport is in terms of mobility and social mobility for elderly people. Anyway, the other thing that happened that day, which is just as an aside, was at the same time the students were protesting about something to do with, I don't know, fees or something that was affecting the students, that they were protesting. And they were protesting in a different part of Dublin City, and Dublin's not that big. So at one point, the two crowds met, and it made for this incredible scene of elderly people and young students. I almost get tearful when I think about it, because it was really fantastic, and it was a real example of intergenerational solidarity. And there were photographs in the paper the next day of elderly people and students, on the streets, and these made the papers. And it was unseen before in Ireland, the idea that the elderly people and students had a common, issue to take with the government at the time. So I suppose that's my long-winded way of saying that there have been those sort of public exposures to the failure of the state to provide. And more recently, we've had massive protests in relation to the attempted introduction of water charges and water meters. And this has been an entire fiasco, and it does look like the government is having to completely withdraw on that. But we are talking huge protests around the country, a mass movement of non-payment of water charges, which has seen a disenfranchised public who had lost faith in the government, and this is a public who, including myself and all other public sector workers, have had their pay cut, and contributions taken out of their salary so as to bail out the banks. And these banks are the same ones who are now refusing to, give some freedom to people who are finding difficulty with payments, and we've got repossessions all over the place and that sort of thing. So
if I could really quickly go back to the rights, and knowing that what's happened in Ireland, which is not unique to Ireland, but with a huge amount of immigration into Ireland with EU changes and shaping and so on and so forth. And when I visit Ireland, I see what I would call a lot of racism and a lot of perspectives around the rights of people who come in to the country. So do you think that changed?
Well,
changing the notion of rights and
they are, because as sort of historically, Irish people haven't been big on rights. We're not good to demand rights and entitlements. And I think it comes from a sort of a Catholic religious perspective that sort of almost says, well, it'll come your way if it's meant for you, sort of thing. That there was very low levels of civil disobedience, very low levels of demand of rights. So they haven't been predominant in Ireland in the past. But I agree with you. I think it has changed, and I think that the rate of emigration into Ireland has helped that conception of rights. But still, the notion of a healthcare system free at the point of delivery, which is accessible if you drive over the border to Northern Ireland, you're in the north of Ireland, you're in the UK, and you can access a National Health Service free at the point of delivery. And that is still, it is a really, really novel concept to most people in Ireland, the idea that you can just get healthcare free at the point of delivery. We're just not, can't perceive it. So it's not something that's being demanded because it is seen as so far from an entitlement or a right. And the market forces have been so predominant. The hegemony of the market forces have just meant that it's assumed that you look to the market to look after your health insurance. And at the time of the Celtic Tiger boom, we were close to 65% of the public had private health insurance. That dropped for the first time ever under 50% at the time of the crisis. Creeping back up again now. So thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed it.